Hello everyone, this is Bonfire Madigan. We're not crazy, the system is. Tune into the Radical Mental Health Show hosted by the Freedom Center, Wednesday nights, 6 to 7 p.m. on Valley Free Radio, WXOJ 103.3 FM.
Hi everybody, this is Will with the Radical Mental Health Show on Wednesday nights on Valley Free Radio. Thanks for tuning in. Tonight we have Bruce Levine, who is a psychologist and author of a very amazing book, Commonsense Rebellion, Taking Back Your Life from Drugs, Shrinks, Corporations, and a World Gone Crazy. And the theme of the show tonight is going to be about how society is behind a lot of what gets diagnosed as mental illness, how the structures of the society we live in end up driving us mad, and what we can do to respond to this rather than just feeding into mainstream corporate institutional responses. So I'm going to introduce Bruce, who's on the phone in a couple of minutes, but I just want to say a few words about the show. The Mental Health Show on Valley Free Radio is sponsored by the Freedom Center, and you can check out our website, which is www.freedom-center.org. We are an advocacy, support, and activism group in Northampton run by and for people with mental health labels, people who've been diagnosed with disorders such as schizophrenia, bipolar, borderline, and we've come together to really challenge those labels and those diagnoses and really look for alternatives to the system. We have a number of different support services. We do educational campaigns, we do protest, and we have legal advocacy and connect people with resources. A few things I want to mention is our Monday night yoga class, which is Mondays 7 to 8:30 in downtown Northampton. That's a free class. We also have a free acupuncture clinic, which is Mondays 4:30 in downtown Northampton. And we're also doing a clinic now in Springfield, 5:30 in downtown Springfield. And our support groups are on Thursday nights. We have a medication withdrawal group at 5:30, and then at 7 we have our regular general emotional support group, which really covers all kinds of things. People come and talk about dreams, they talk about different emotional crises or difficulties they're going through. People get help with housing. We talk about medications and alternatives to medication, or how to use your medications most effectively, wisely, how to communicate with your doctors and therapists. We deal with human rights issues, human rights abuses. So it's really a question of what it is that people come to the group for. Every group is really pretty different, and the group has been going on for about 5 years now. So all this information is available on our website, which is freedom-center.org. Check it out. So I am very happy to be introducing Bruce Levine. As I said, he's the author of a pretty amazing book that goes really deep into these issues. It's called Commonsense Rebellion, Taking Back Your Life from Drugs, Shrinks, Corporations, and a World Gone Crazy. Dr. Levine is a clinical psychologist and has been in private practice for over 22 years, and he has given talks and workshops to diverse organizations throughout North America. He's also quite a prolific writer, and there's a number of articles. If you search for Bruce Levine or go to his website, brucelevine.net, you can read a number of his articles. He is on the Advisory Council of the International Center for the Study of Psychiatry and Psychology, and on the editorial advisory board of the journal Ethical Human Psychology and Psychiatry. Dr. Levine is a regular contributor to Z Magazine, which is a progressive social justice-oriented magazine, published out of Cambridge, Massachusetts, I think. And his articles and interviews have been published in numerous other magazines. So I want to welcome Bruce Levine to the show. Let me see if I can get you on the phone here. Bruce, are you there? Can you hear us?
Yeah, I'm here.
Hey, welcome to the show. It's really a pleasure to have you here.
It's good to be on your show.
Well, there's a lot of things that your writing talks about, and I'm really interested in this sort of general theme about how society really is the driving force behind what gets identified and labeled as mental illness, and also sort of what we can do about it, which I think we both would agree would be changing society. So what do you want to say to just get us started off here?
Probably the most important reason why I wrote Commonsense Rebellion, because there's a lot of great books, as I'm sure your audience is aware of, that criticizes, sort of debunks what's problematic about psychiatric drugs And for me, one of the problems that isn't looked at enough is that it's not only that a lot of these psychiatric drugs are fairly useless and dangerous and create all sorts of problematic dependencies. What happens is when you kind of medicalize increasing numbers of problems out there, that people are diverted, really distracted from kind of taking a look at the humanizing aspects of society and culture. And so the most interesting things for me are the statistics that point not to any kind of biochemical causes of mental illness, but all kinds of social causes. Let me just give you one example, and we can go on, but we have like a tenfold, maybe even higher than that, increase in the rate of depression in the U.S. in the last 50 years. We have people being classified who are mentally disabled. It went from just 1 out of 500 in 1903 to 1 out of 75 in 1987. And then after the Prozac blitz and all the SSRI blitz, we moved up to about 1 out of 50 people who were classified as mentally disabled. So,
and that includes
clearly there's something going on in society and culture. I mean, our biochemistry, our genes, they just don't change in a couple of generations. They take thousands of generations. So that's just the obvious place that people should be taking a look at what's going on there.
So when you say mentally disabled, you're talking about all the different mental health diagnoses.
Right. Those numbers, when I'm talking about 1 out of 50 have been classified as disabled, mentally ill, those are based on Social Security Administration payments.
Now, one of the things that we've often talked about is that surely a part of that is the marketing itself of these illnesses, and the way in which, the more illness you have, the more drugs. But I think you're absolutely right. Another part of it is that people are experiencing more emotional distress.
Well, that's a good point. I think it's a combination. When you see those huge statistics, and again, these are all speculations here. I mean, I think the important thing for people to understand, it has to be something going on societally here. And then after that, it's open to a lot of speculation. One is, what you've just said. I think, there's certainly certain number of those folks who are getting paid for, on Social Security disabled payment. I mean, I know some of these folks. They don't seem crazy to me. I mean, and a lot of these folks, just because the economy is what it is, there's an increasing number of people who are perfectly okay folks who are getting marginalized. And they are terrified of entering the economy, given what it is, and so that's a certain percentage. I don't call them cheaters or anything like that. I mean, I don't know how you could call somebody who's making $500, $600, $700 a month, willing to accept that because they're just terrified of like being a part of this sort of economy. It's just hard for their kind of temperament to make it. So that's one part of it. Another part of it is this huge. Obviously, the pharmaceutical companies, they are probably the major aspect of it, and just a kind of promoting of anybody who's having a kind of difficult time of it out there, that they must be mentally ill and they must be on psychiatric drugs. Then the psychiatric drugs themselves, we know, will actually probably create more serious mental illness than they're going to help anyone with. So that's another factor. When you've got anywhere from 1% to 6% of people who are taking SSRIs and who are moving into just from being mildly depressed into manic reactions and appearing psychotic. So you got a lot of different factors, I think, that go into that creation of this huge increase of mental illness. A lot of more interesting, I think, just general cultural and societal ones that maybe we can get into here too.
So the three ones that you mentioned are there's more people in distress. There are people who are being marginalized, they aren't fitting in, and they're ending up on disability and ending up with diagnoses. And then there's the marketing that the pharmaceutical companies are doing to promote more people getting these diagnoses. And then something that you said is very interesting as well is the idea that, which I just forgot what the other factor was. Oh, the idea that the medications themselves, the side effects of the medications actually make these conditions worse often, and then actually you get more people. And is there pretty strong, I know we've talked about this on the show before, but what comes to your mind in terms of evidence for making that claim that the medications are actually making a lot of people worse?
Well, I mean, even establishment psychiatry admits, like, for example, on some of these on these antidepressants, that a certain percentage have manic reactions, psychotic manic reactions. Now, so all we're debating about is the number. So folks like Peter Bregan, they're going to be saying, I don't know, somewhere 6 or 7%, and folks in establishment psychiatry, they're going to be saying 1%. But no one disagrees that certainly when you're going to be taking kind of neurotransmitter stimulating kind of drugs, that a certain percentage, percentage of people are going to get manic with it, going to get pretty crazy with it. So that's just kind of common sense, and there's no real argument. There's only argument about the percentages there. But I think there's some more interesting stuff, even forgetting about the big farm takeover of a pharmaceutical company's takeover of psychiatry. Even prior to that, if you take a look back at histories of kind of industrialized societies, that there's a lot of evidence that when societies became more industrialized, yeah, sure, there were more material goods, but a lot of other things started to kind of give way. And we have, like, World Health Organization did some studies where they found that societies where there were more kind of the wealthier, more consumeristic societies actually had higher rates of mental illness. There's another real interesting study, at least it is for me, as a guy of public policy health researcher, a guy named Vega, V-E-G-A, a few years back. He studied Mexican immigrants.
Yeah, I remember reading about that. That's an amazing study.
Really interesting.
Yeah.
And what he did is big sample, huge sample. And what he did was he took a look at folks who were new Mexican immigrants compared to folks who had been Mexican Americans who'd been here. Either they were first generation Mexican American or they had been here for at least 13 years. And the price, when you get to America, you get more material goodies. That's why folks come here. But the price that the folks paid, clearly in the study, was that they had twice the rate of mental illness. And in terms of depressive episodes, they were three times the rate. So the assimilation from Mexican Americans to from Mexico to America, and they were actually the new Mexican immigrants were comparable to folks who stayed in Mexico, and folks who were Mexican Americans who were second generation, and folks who had lived here for 13 years. Those were the folks who were having like double the rate of mental illness and three times the rate of depressive disorders. Now Vega, he said, when folks asked him, well, why is it? He says, again, we can only speculate. We know what's happening. We know that society is the cause here, but we don't know exactly what. And he said, look, these folks are coming over to a place where they once they were used to a lot of social support, a lot of cooperative kind of a lifestyle, and all of a sudden, when you come to America, there's a lot of material goodies, and it's a good place if you're very aggressive and very ambitious. It's a place to make some money if you're one of those kind of folks. But it's kind of an everyone for yourself society for a lot of people, and that's what his conclusion was. Other people, there's some other sort of explanations for this kind of societal force. When people were looking at the UN statistics on that sort of increasing kind of mental illness in kind of consumeristic societies, one of the things that they said, which made a lot of sense to me, it really hit home, was that they're thinking like, when you come to a society like America or Western societies, we're talking about European societies, but mostly here in America, here it's even more so, is that there's higher expectations for success. There's higher expectations. People see, people put more pressure on themselves to succeed, and if they don't, that failure is a lot more painful, and it's going to move some people into violence, with other people, and it's going to move some people, into resentment. It's going to move some people into really being angry with themselves, feeling like a failure. So just that idea that you're supposed to succeed and just meeting those expectations, that's a factor there too. I think the other factor, just in general, for me, very big factors that you have to take a look at is just a diminishment of community, which I was talking about a little bit before, a real diminishment in many ways of autonomy. If you take a look at what people did for a living 100 years ago, a lot of people, again, not well, there was tough lives, physically difficult lives. They weren't, not a lot of material goodies, but a lot more autonomy. A lot of, 100 years ago, most folks in America were still family farmers, and so a lot more control over your lives in a lot of ways, and a lot more meaningfulness. I saw a study which I put in Commonsense Rebellion where a guy named Andrew Kimbrell is head of the International Center for Technology Assessment, reported a study show 80% of people say what they do for a living is utterly meaningless. And see, for me, things like meaninglessness is a huge, to have a meaningful life is a huge antidote to any kind of severe mental difficulties. And I'm not the first person to say that. Folks like Viktor Frankl, who was in a concentration camp. That was his whole, when you were a man's search for meaning. It's just, it's just pretty obvious to a lot of people who've really been out there dealing with people that if you have meaning in your life, it could get you through a lot of tough things. And if your life is utterly meaningless, you're much more fragile. You're not that resilient. And this is obvious to a lot of folks out there, except for modern psychiatry, who, with all of this data, all of this, all of these things to look at, they're looking for these phantom biochemical mumbo jumbo reasons.
Would you say that really fits into kind of a social control agenda that psychology and psychiatry have? You mentioned before about distracting us from the obvious social, political, economic factors and getting us into the whole brain explanation.
Well, I think the way the social control works is, a couple levels. I think that these guys, most of these psychiatrists that I've ever talked to, are if you told them, like you're really functioning as an agent of social control in a kind of totalitarian society to maintain class levels and all kinds of stuff, they'd look at you like you were. They really, honestly, wouldn't know what the heck you were talking about. But I think I think you're correct, but the way it works is that folks who do want to maintain a certain hierarchy, a certain status quo, like to have psychiatrists around because they're a nice sort of kind of a. You've got prisons for your actual criminals, people who are marginalized, that way. But what do you do with people who've committed no legal crimes but are sort of, getting increasingly marginalized by society? I mean, they don't want to have anything to do with them. So you have these kind of psychological, interpersonal, biochemical cops who you call psychiatrists, and so. They exist. Nobody's going to really exist in great numbers with great power and great money behind you, unless those folks who are sort of running the society want you to exist, and that's how psychiatry, sort of found their niche. And also, too, they're kind of salespeople on the street for drug companies, and so that's a pretty major industry. When you're talking about antidepressants alone, sort of a $12 billion a year industry, and so they have. Their societal that's kind of their societal function.
Right. And so what was sort of the direction that you're thinking in terms of the solution for these the sort of the larger forces that are driving people more and more into emotional distress in our society? I know the word community and autonomy come up a lot in your work. Where do you see the solution to all this coming from?
Well, I think that, number one, is it's real important that people, I think for some people I talk to, of course, for some people what I'm saying is depressing and scary. But for other people I talk to, it's very kind of validating. It's sort of energizing to say, hey, wait a minute, I'm not crazy. I'm not sick. I'm really an okay human being. And that maybe part of why I've got so much pain and so much angst here is that maybe I'm just not willing to numb myself to some of these realities of how crazy and dehumanizing our society is. And that's sort of part of what I try to do with folks is recognizing that without some energy and without some morale, you can't do anything. And so there's a lot of really neat, obvious things that people could be doing to improve their life, but if people are utterly demoralized, they're immobilized and they can't do anything. So I think one of the first things that people have to do with one another, and again, it helps to do it. You don't need authorities to do this. You don't need doctors to do it. In fact, from my experience, doctors and authorities are probably least capable in our society of being these kind of morale builders, cheerleaders, inspirers. People can do that among themselves. So one of the first things that people need to do is look towards each other. Anybody around them in their life who actually gives them some energy, and then when they have some energy, they can act on it. Some of the kind of obvious things that people, we know people from studies show us that when people hang out with people more, when they have relationships, when they have a network of people, they're much less likely to have severe emotional difficulties. We know when people exercise more that they're going to have a better life. We know when people have more positive thoughts, they're going to be less likely to be depressed. But I think some of the more interesting things that people need to think about is just a kind of different way of looking at their problems. And I think one of the things that we've been socialized to do in our culture and society is anytime we have any kind of problem, from a psychological problem to a friendship problem to an economic problem to a legal problem, any problem, we're supposed to hand it over to authorities. And there's a lot of problems to that. I mean, I think that hurts people in a lot of ways. I mean, what happens is not only do they kind of lose sort of a sense of autonomy by doing that, that what also happens is that they forget that the way that problems themselves can be sort of a catalyst, sort of can be something that people can use to create community. So in other words, when you talk to people who do have a lot of friends out there, or who have a kind of rich life of community, you'll often find that how it happened was they took their problems seriously, and they tried to make something happen with them. So, for example, folks who started the Support Coalition International Mind Freedom groups were folks who had this problem of feeling, victimized by a kind of psychiatric establishment. Well, they could have just kind of whined and cried and beat up themselves, or just complained, or they could have said, like, how can I find other people in my same boat? And part of the thing that I think that people need to think in terms of is that even if you can't sort of solve your problem, even if your goal is to change the whole political system, or your goal is to eliminate psychiatry, even if at some intellectual level you say, well, maybe this stuff is not going to happen in my lifetime, it's still a smart thing in terms of your mental health to pursue this, because on the way to making it happen, maybe you get lucky and you do have some successes, but even if you don't have successes, you can connect with people and you can form community and get some energy that way.
Exactly. This is you've really put your finger right on the philosophy that the Freedom Center started out with. I mean, we are both an activist group for human rights, and we're educating people, really challenging the institutional structures, but we're also realizing that we're doing this for a very concrete reason, which is to support each other and to find an outlet and find a connection and find a community around our experiences. And you're absolutely right. I mean, that's where the healing comes from, is the community that gets generated in the struggle, not just the promise or the hope of something getting delivered in the future. So let me ask you this: do you see people, as I know you're a psychologist, do you see people in individual one-on-one therapy, and how does that work? I mean, what
I see them, I'll see families. I'll work with individuals, and I'll work with couples, and so all kinds of things I'll do.
So it's often about like reframing their understanding of their problems.
It's different for every person, but generally what's going on for me is somebody's coming in. A lot of people who know about me have already establishment, conventional psychiatry, and psychology too has failed them, and they hear about me, and they're at some level realizing that, wait a minute, maybe they're having some serious difficulties in life. Maybe they're even doing some really stupid things. But they don't feel like that they're really biochemically deficient here. They feel something else is amiss, something psychological, something social, something spiritual, something even political. And for me, all of those things, philosophical, all of those things sort of come together when I'm working with people. And a lot of way, I should tell people out there in your audience, some the obvious thing, people used to know this 20, 30 years ago, and it's one of the many kind of things that has been swept under the carpet, is that counseling therapy is no scientific thing. It's very much like teaching. It's not scientific. It works for some people, and it doesn't work for a lot of other folks, and it can be counterproductive for some people. And the key piece in it, just like a kind of a teacher is if you're on the same wavelength. If a client out there, or patient, or whatever you want to call a customer, I don't really care that much what the terms are. If they feel that they feel there's mutual respect and there's mutual affection, and that you're on the same kind of page basically in terms of values, then a lot of good things could happen. But if you're not, it's usually a waste of time. And like I say, in some cases, I've had a lot of folks out there who it can be really counterproductive. Some of the things that people often talk about, the horrors of psychiatric drugs, but some pretty horrible things could happen interpersonally, and just in terms of straight-out therapy, too.
Absolutely. We have a number of people who we work with at the Freedom Center who've had just horrendous experiences in one-on-one therapy. It's kind of like you're trapped in this secret, private one-on-one situation, and there's a huge power imbalance, and the potential for that being misused is incredibly huge.
Right. I think a lot of things that it's kind of fun for me to really kind of disclose to people what's going on in a lot of shrinks' heads, and one of the scariest things I think about shrinks in general is that when they get anxious about something going on out there, they tend to do some pretty incongruent, ugly, controlling things if they're not aware of it. And in the old days, more and more people would at least be trained in that, to think about that. It's like, so for example, for example, one of the things I talk about a lot is I notice a lot of psychiatrists, psychologists seem to be pretty obedient, compliant people. And then they get these patients out there who are in a lot of cases, disobedient, non-compliant. And from my point of view, I kind of like them. But for a lot, if you're an obedient, compliant type person, and you see folks who are a little bit more risk-taking, a little more anti-authoritarian, who really are not so submissive, it's going to get you uncomfortable. And a really good compliant shrink will say, "Oh, well, they'll understand what's going on there." But often, what's happening is they'll immediately get a little anxious. And then they'll go ahead and they'll start to pathologize folks. And once they really seriously pathologize them, they're going to medicate them and drug them. I mean, it's much similar, like when you look at 20, 30 years ago, homosexuality was a DSM psychiatric disorder. What was happening? Well, you'd get these gay clients who'd walk in, and the shrinks would get really anxious because, they for whatever reason, they made them uptight. And so they would pathologize them. They would disease them. And I think a lot of people, would like to believe that one day psychiatry really realized, wow, we learned from our mistakes, and we're going to, this is not really a disease, and we're going to make it something that's normal. But really, what happened? It was a political fight. That there were gay psychologists, gay psychiatrists who were really upset about being pathologized just because shrinks who were, other shrinks were made anxious by that, and so they fought for it, and I think a lot of people don't understand that what's in that DSM, that Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, it's mainly a political document. And if people have enough guts and they're willing to fight for things, they can get anything out of that. And they can also get anything in there, too.
Yeah,
so a lot of diagnoses and disorders were put in there for all kinds of political reasons as well.
Yeah, they actually vote on the diagnoses.
Sure,
the homosexuality was voted out of the DSM. So if people are just tuning in, we're talking with Bruce Levine. He's a psychologist and author of Commonsense Rebellion, Taking Back Your Life from Drugs, Shrinks, Corporations, and a World Gone Crazy. You can find out more about Bruce's work at his website, which is brucelevine.net. Bruce, let me ask you this. I was at a conference a few weeks ago, and David Oakes of Mind Freedom International was there, and he mentioned one of the problems that the people who are the psychiatric survivor movement, the critical psychology movement, people who are challenging psychiatry and mental health, one of the problems we often run up against is that the social justice activists, the liberals, the progressives, the Democrats, often are saying more. We want more services. We want more mental health care. We want more programs. We want more money spent on mental health. From your perspective, with this very fundamental kind of critique that you've got, how do we sort of deal with that? How do we bridge the gap between sort of the movement that we're part of and then the social justice activists who may be saying, well, look, we just need to spend more money on mental health services, and that's the answer?
Well, that's a question I think a lot about. And first, the good news. The good news is that folks who are progressive, who would call themselves more radical left, they get it. And I know that because Z Magazine publishes all my stuff. And so if people went on my website and they looked at recent articles, they'd see a bunch of Z Magazine articles like U.S. mental illness epidemic or depathologizing the spirit of existence or stuff on Paxil scandals. And so the folks who in the old days, they more anti-authoritarian left, whatever you want to call them, libertarian socialists or anarchists or communitarian or anarchist, all those kinds of folks, they get it. They realize that psychiatry is just being, is a kind of a wing to, an arm of the state, an arm of the industrial, sort of psychopharmaceutical industrial complex. The problem is, what you're talking about, that liberal group, the sort of folks who you would the same kinds of folks who really understand, the horrors of, agribusinesses or big oil or all of these other things. They utterly go into denial and are completely blind about the kind of biotech, the sort of psychopharmaceutical industrial complex. And it is a little bit exasperating. It is a little bit frustrating, and that I think part of it, and part of what I've really worked to try to kind of fine-tune my message to these folks is that they want to believe, that certainly really education and mental health they should be sort of social justice, liberal left, causes. The problem is that, and this is, ask yourself, why is it that, George Bush and the pharmaceutical companies all of a sudden care about mental health? Do you really think that these people really care about social justice and, and education and mental well-being? Do you really think that his no kid left behind, no student left behind, no child left behind? You think really all of those things have anything to do with really caring about education or caring about mental health? And so a part of what you have to do, I think, with this population is slowly educate them to the fact that you can exploit certain kind of sort of co-opt left kind of issues or liberal issues or social justice issues and exploit them for your own political agenda and to make money off of it. And that's what's happened to the issue of mental illness, and that's I've had some success in getting people who ordinarily just kind of consider themselves your liberal kind of but not real radical folks to slowly to get a handle on this. But part of the problem is the media has done such a great job at saying anybody who's a critic of psychiatry is some kind of Scientologist or some kind of crazy right winger who just really is trivializing mental difficulties or doesn't care about the stigma of mental illness and all this kind of stuff. And so they've got that drummed into their head, that if they're not, a total supporter of psychiatry, that means that they're some kind of a right winger, and you have to kind of like have them understand, well, wait a minute, man, this is not what's going on here.
Right. It's like, well, we're against the mainstream mental health system and psychiatry's approach, but we also recognize that people are really in some kind of distress and they do need some kind of help, but it may not be what's been laid out for us by mainstream corporate society. That's certainly an approach that we come up against this all the time in our work around mental health of the Freedom Centers. We're treated like civil libertarians who don't care about people who are homeless or having a really severe crisis. And those are us. I mean, we've been through this and we do care, and we're looking for alternatives, but we're saying that the situation that's what's being offered by the mainstream is really not helpful.
Yeah, one of the interesting things is you'll see them always, the folks who are sort of like the knee-jerk reaction of any kind of establishment psychiatry person who feels criticized is like you people are promoting the stigma of mental illness. I mean, it's almost like they don't even hear what you're saying, and that's kind of often a knee-jerk reaction. And I've thought about that a lot, and I think, wait a minute. It seems to me that the more that folks have medicalized mental illness, that in some ways the more there has been a stigma.
Exactly.
I mean, if you go back, there's an interesting biography out there on Lincoln's depression by a guy named Shank. I'll give him a plug there along with my Commonsense Rebellion. And what he talks about is when Lincoln was a well-known depressive. He had two periods in life where they had suicidal watches. He had his law partner for over a decade saying, "This is the most depressing, gloomy guy I've ever known." I mean, it was pretty well. He spends about a third of the book establishing that. There's no doubt about it. By today's standards, this guy would have been, classified as a depressive, and he was well known to the media and to the general public. And yet they voted him in president. And people back in that day, they didn't see that as so much of a stigma. They were a lot brighter, at least about that aspect of life, and realizing, sometimes people who have severe emotional difficulties, they have some really great gifts.
Often
and this might be exactly the kind of guy we want in. And then you fast forward up to through the era of medicalization of emotional difficulties, and you have a guy like Eagleton, who George McGovern picks for his vice presidential candidate in '72, and the word gets out that he's been treated for his depression, and boom, he gets booted off of that ticket in no time because of the stigma. And so, I think people should start thinking a little bit that maybe, here's the thing, maybe, you don't have to just a lot of folks think that just because folks who are criticizing these kind of medicalizing depression, we must be saying that mental illness is a sin or it's weakness or something like that, and none of the above. I mean, there's a lot of people out there who care passionately about mental emotional difficulties and want to help folks who do not see mental difficulties as either medical illness, or don't see it as a weakness, or don't see it, as anything to be stigmatized about. And those are the folks, I think, that are really helping helping much more to destigmatize people, having severe emotional difficulties.
Exactly. It's not an either-or kind of thing. It's kind of set up as, well, you care about people, and therefore you have to see it as a medical issue, or you don't care about people. And the question of stigma and biology, there actually, I think, was a study recently done in Germany where they looked at people, and they did a comparison of people who had gotten the message that, we believe that mental illness is a biological problem. And the people who believed that mental illness was a biological problem had more fear and more stereotypes of people who were mentally ill than the people who thought it was some other cause. So the idea that you can erase stigma by blaming biology and say, oh, well, it's the person's brain is different. Actually, that doesn't really make a lot of sense at all.
Right. I think one of the things that there's another important issue is I call the myth of progress, and that people want to believe that across the board, there's progress happening in every area of life, and they can see there has been an increased tolerance for certain folks out there. We were talking about folks who are gay. There's certainly still plenty of racism, but I'm sure folks would say there is certainly a lot less problems for folks who are African American now than there would have been 150 years ago. And so there's certain areas where there's a lot of progress, but I think it's a myth of progress overall to believe that's going on. I'll give you the most important example for me is I think there's an increased kind of bigotry and intolerance in our society and culture. Again, a lot of ways having to do with this kind of sort of extremist industrialized society. Again, there's the bigotry against folks who really don't fit into this culture as well. I think there was a higher level of tolerance for folks, who were a little bit considered more eccentric 100 years ago. There was certainly a much higher level of tolerance and even respect and admiration for folks who were anti-authoritarian, who were non-compliant, who were disobedient. And so the more you kind of have an institutionalized, bureaucratized, industrialized society, you're going to have an increasing kind of a sort of a bigotry, I think, and that's in a lot of ways what psychiatry is. It's sort of a kind of an institutionalized bigotry against certain kinds of temperaments that 150 years ago, people would have fit into culture and society just fine.
Or they would have had spaces that they could retreat to, or that they could be left alone.
Oh, sure.
And one question I had is, do you think that there's a relationship between the growing sort of medical, psychiatry, pharmaceutical culture and the environmental crisis that we're moving deeper and deeper into?
In what sense?
Well, in the sense that there's a way in which our relationship to nature is being stripped from us, and then we're becoming more and more technological creatures, more and more dependent on technological interventions and technological controls.
Again, an old-time word, that is a great word that people used to use a lot to explain a lot of our emotional difficulties was alienation. And there's all kinds of alienation or disconnecting. And I think when you understand that for folks to feel some mental peace, they want to feel a certain wholeness. And any kind of disconnecting or alienation is going to bring a certain kind of havoc. That for some person it's going to make them uptight, another person is going to make them depressed, somebody else is substance abuser, and on and on. But the key alienations that people have are, and one you just touched on, was an alienation just from nature. From life, and that you've got more and more people who are completely disconnected from anything in nature. People also get disconnected from people. You got a lot of isolated, lonely people. You've got people who are You got people who are in marriages who are utterly disconnected, even if they're married. They're utterly alienated from their spouse. You got people alienated from their very self. But in terms of it, I think it's a really huge, important connection between the environmental movement and what we're talking about here, mental health issues, which I've tried to bridge that a lot with folks, folks who care about sustainable environmental society, is to have them to understand that and they get it when you explain that to them, that of course if you're going to have people completely disconnected from life, from nature, from all kinds of non-human life, from even the sky and the earth, you're going to have increasing kinds of mental difficulties.
Well, it seems like a lot of the growing cancer rates, for example, one of the things that we're encouraged to not think about is pollution. And I think that one of the things that I've found in my own healing and recovery from a schizophrenia diagnosis is that I had to look at the toxins in my life, the chemical pollutants in the food that I was eating, as a way of getting back control over my own body and my own health that directly was contributing to what was getting diagnosed as schizophrenia. And that's a very political and very economic issue. The food that we eat and the health of the air that we breathe and the water that we drink and the environment that we live in.
You're bringing up a really good point, and it gives me a chance to do some clarifying, is that I think that when people say that, that it's a problem to medicalize mental illness, we're not saying that medical problems or physical problems can't cause emotional difficulties. Two different things. So, for example, I certainly believe that all kinds of severe pain can be a precipitant for kinds of emotional difficulties. And so, for example, if people are completely eating horribly and they're completely feeling physically like garbage, and they're not even kind of in touch with that, and that's just sort of kind of wearing them out, that can be a precipitant for them moving into all kinds of emotional difficulties, including depression. But that's very different than saying that there are specific biochemical markers for something like schizophrenia or depression.
Exactly. I think that one of the things that happens around anxiety is that people, if you have a chronic illness, whether it's a tooth infection that's not getting addressed or some pain in your body that's not getting acknowledged, that's going to lead to anxiety. You're going to have chronic low-grade anxiety because your body is telling you something is wrong here.
Right. And I think a key thing for people, one of the things that I try to do, I don't know what you want to call it, democratize. I mean, people throw that word around, but I think it's real important for people to understand that everybody, including psychiatrists, psychologists, every human being, when they are subject to lots of stress, lots of pain, they're going to be vulnerable to their own particular kind of deterioration. And, for some people, their deterioration is to move into some kind of depression. For some people, it's to move into what look like these psychological, so-called DSM mental illnesses. But, in other cultures and other societies, if somebody moved into, for example, pathological lying, I mean, that would be considered a mental illness. And, it just so happens in our culture, I mean, you could get elected president being, a well-known liar. I mean, you could also, be a well-respected business person, be considered incredibly greedy and ambitious, where, and again, in other cultures, that would be viewed as something like sort of a mental illness that people would say, well, this person must be really hurting. They must be in a lot of pain to care about taking everybody's money and having it all for themselves. But not in our culture. So there's all kinds of ways. I think every human being has a certain path of deteriorating, and in any culture, some folks just happen to be designated as the mentally ill ones. And unfortunately, in our culture, I think there's a lot of folks out there who, that if you want to start throwing around the label of mental illness, not in a kind of medical sense, but more in a like, oh my God, this person's really acting horribly, that you might have a healthier society if you saw folks moving into extreme greed or lying. If you started calling that mental illness rather than people who were just immobilized because and depressed.
You mentioned spirituality before, and do you think that there's a way in which the kind of materialist scientific worldview makes it impossible or tries to make it impossible to see their experiences, people's experiences of madness, as something that has a spiritual component? And I'm talking about just the way in which so many different cultures around the world interact with the spirit world, and there's an understanding of ancestors that may be jealous or angry or disturbed, or there may be some spirit or ghost around, and that rather than seeing that as something that's just naive and infantile and irrelevant and irrational, that there's really something to that. What are your thoughts about that?
I think nobody knows for sure. It's very very hard to, and we can. This is probably another discussion for another day. To actually do real science, to say with certainty what are the causes of any particular emotional difficulty. And so a lot of what we do in our culture and every other culture is you form certain beliefs about them, and those beliefs become sort of a fact. I mean, it's sort of once you really believe in something is a cause, well, then it will be a cause. And actually, too, I should say, is once you believe in something is a solution, there's a good chance it will be a solution, too, as well. So a lot of really what the kind of belief in sort of biochemical causes of mental difficulties and these sort of use of drugs and all these other kind of biochemical procedures, it's very faith-based. And we know from studies that the more actually people buy into it, then they actually, work at least temporarily. And the more people don't buy into it at all, they don't work at all, and they're counterproductive. And so it becomes very interesting for me. The choices, what do you believe? Well, if you believe in nothing, because you're such a critical thinker, such a cynic, such a skeptic. I mean, there's a downside to that. It's like, what do you do when you get really bummed out? What do you believe in caused it? What do you believe is going to be your way to get out of it? Well, for a lot of folks who are really skeptical, really cynical, they're in trouble. As opposed to some folks who say, look, there's a lot of stuff that science can tell us. There's a lot of truths that we know. But there's some areas that they're really open to beliefs. They're open to philosophy. They're open to spirituality. They're open to our values. And we can choose to believe in certain things that will make us or not make, or create a neater life for us or not. And so when you take a look at some of the belief systems of pre-industrial peoples and tribal life, what some of the stuff that you're talking about, it resulted in more community,
exactly.
And
that's
in
what
some ways it's a lot more fun too.
That's what I was thinking. Is that it may be that they can't. There's no scientific proof for these spirits, but the way that the healer interacts with the person, interacts with the spirits, it creates meaning. It brings the society together. It ends up creating some kind of resolution to it, and it's useful and positive for the health of the society. And how else are you going to measure, healing and care if that's
right.
If that's not
right?
it?
You can have a choice out there once you understand the science or the lack thereof of, like, say, for example, on antidepressants. And I've got a lot of work on that, and not just me, but there's a lot. If you look at science, even pharmaceutical companies, shaky science shows that these antidepressants really don't do any better than placebos. Although you're going to have a certain percentage of people who say, hey, they help me, they save me, but when you do real science and you compare them to a kind of control group of placebos, and you do, the difference is there's almost no difference. And when you do real science, not pharmaceutical company science, there is no difference. So basically, these things are without any kind of real scientific value. Although, like I said, there are some people who use their Prozac and Paxil and say it saved my life. And so, okay, you want to believe in that, see where that gets you. Okay, versus, let's say you decide as a culture, like, we're going to believe there's a healing mountain, okay? Now, again, you're not going to do any science worth a lick that's going to prove that this mountain actually heals. But from my point of view, you haven't showed me any kind of science that any of the antidepressants do anything either. And we know what their adverse effects are.
Yeah, the
and
mountain
doesn't. We know how dangerous they are. And we know, like, wow, if everybody happened to believe in that mountain, and what a kind of a neat thing it would be. First of all, it would be environmentally pretty cool. They wouldn't make sure anything happened to that mountain. The second thing is that they would all, there would be a lot of neat community and a lot of probably fun festivals. And at the end of the day, very pragmatically, okay, they would be doing a lot better off.
So you mentioned depression before. You're working on a book on depression?
Right.
Tell us a little bit about that. I'm really interested in this whole issue because, virtually everybody experiences depression in our society. Everyone.
Right, and that was what I wanted to do. When I came back from touring with a Commonsense Rebellion, that was clear to me that there was just huge. I spoke to thousands of people, and I said I had a chapter in Commonsense Rebellion on depression, but it was mostly kind of a critical. Most of the Commonsense Rebellion, I bet about 75-80% of it is a kind of social psychiatric criticism, and about 20-25% of it is sort of like help. What do you do? Solutions. And I said, wow, this depression thing is so huge that I need to write a whole book on it, and I need to really focus in on the areas. I need to think about those people who I really like, who have psychiatry has totally failed them, and these people tend to be, again, my clients, my friends, people that I kind of tend to like are folks who are more skeptical, more anti-authoritarian, more critical thinking kind of folks, and the people who I've a lot of these people still, as skeptical and as critical thinking as they are, they still gave psychiatry or gave psychology a try, and it was a failure for them. So the reason the book that I decided to write a book I'm not into proselytizing, convincing. If you're happy with your Prozac and Paxil and Zoloft, fine. Don't bother buying my book. Don't bother coming to my talks. I mean, I'm not a proselytizer. I'm not a Scientologist or a psychiatrist. Those guys are into proselytizing the world to get it, to convert everybody into their fold. My audience are people who've already kind of rejected it. They've rejected it because it's failed them or their family or friends. They've rejected it because they know the statistic. They know really the science. And so I started to kind of think about this group of people and what could really help them. And there was a lot of important areas that psychologists and psychiatrists they're just I would give them an F. I mean, a couple of areas, maybe 30 years ago, I'd give them a C or a D, but I'd never have given them an A or a B. And nowadays, in all of these important areas that are necessary to help depressed people, I'd give them pretty much failing grades.
When is your book going to be out?
Well, we'll see. It's got publishers are looking at it right now. Here, my agent's passing it around. We'll see. I can't tell. Hopefully next year. We'll see what happens with it.
Well, Bruce, this has been wonderful. Unfortunately, we're winding down and out of time here. We're talking with Bruce Levine. He's the author of Commonsense Rebellion. You can check out his website, brucelevine.net. Is there any last words or thoughts you want to leave us with?
I guess the most important thing for me is that people really start to realize that they and their friends have solutions among themselves. And anything that I could say in 15 seconds is that, there's some authorities out there that are worth giving respect to. I mean, I certainly take my car to a mechanic that I really respect, and I respect my dentist. He knows how to, do well with crowns, and so it's not like I dismiss all authorities. But a lot of things in terms of your psychological difficulties, you can be dealing with yourself, with your friends, and sort of, you might want to think about taking some of the authority back in your own life.
Great. Well, thank you very much, Bruce Levine, for joining us on the show today.
Thank you for having me on.
Great. That was Bruce Levine, author of Commonsense Rebellion, Taking Back Your Life from Drugs, Shrinks, Corporations, and a World Gone Crazy. His website is brucelevine.net. And you're listening to Valley Free Radio. This is the Radical Mental Health Show on Wednesday nights. I'm Will Hall. Check out our website, freedom-center.org. We'll be back next week. And until then, thanks for tuning in.